So thank you all so much for being here. We're so excited to have such a great turnout for this very important discussion that we're having this evening. So just by way of introduction, my name is Camila Shahid Diallo. I serve as the Vice President of Strategy and Community Engagement for the Mind Trust. We're honored to be doing these conversations in partnership with UNCF. Over the past 2 years now, we've been having these community conversations around education, and they started really as listening sessions. We thought it was really important to take time to just listen to community voices around concerns that people were having within the education conversation or lack of conversations that were being had around education with the community. And there were a lot of themes that continue to come up, and equity was one of them. So we're really excited to have this discussion today with our esteemed panel, who will talk about equity from a variety of perspectives. But I want to first pass it off to Andrea to share a little bit more about UNCF and the role in this partnership that we've had.
Good evening. Andrea Neely, Regional Development Director for UNCF. And we've had this partnership, as she shared, since 2013. And that came out of the work that UNCF had started doing with STAND and various partners, United Way, the Urban League, of really having a place where people could really talk about what their needs were. Being fair and equitable in education was very important. UNCF has been in the market for many years, and we're a resource to those students that we'll be talking about today. Annually, we're supporting them through scholarships by developing partnership with the Mind Trust, as well as with our wonderful superintendents and partners such as IU Health. We're developing scholarships, and we're really targeting toward those students in communities that have challenges with their schools and performances, but also that there are resources for those students who, of course, can go to college when they're in a great school system, K through 12. And so UNCF's purpose is to get in front of it, because we see a lot of students coming to our institutions and schools that we also support that are not HBCUs, not prepared. And so we want to see them in a better place, not them to start school and end up with debt because they're not able to complete. By partnering with those of you in this room that are supporting the work that we're doing, and of course the work that the Mind Trust, our goal is really to diminish the transition of students not getting to and through school, but actually being successful K through 12 and not worrying if they're going to be able to make it. So this is the partnership that we've had the opportunity to develop along with many partners, and particularly those that have been supporting UNCF for many years. And for that, I say thank you, and I'm looking forward to a wonderful discussion from the panel.
We also want to make sure that we recognize our Mayor, Hogsett, who we're thrilled to have with us this evening. The Mayor's office has done such a wonderful job in chartering schools, and we're really excited about the direction that your new administration will have with the city as well as education. So thank you for being here.
My name is Sekou Biddle. I'm Vice President for Advocacy at UNCF, and several years ago, we began to look at what are the things UNCF can be doing to increase the number of African Americans successfully going to and through college. Many of you know UNCF for 72 years has been in the business of supporting a network of small private HBCUs, mostly across the South and Southeast. We started doing that 72 years ago, and then grew over the years and decades into scholarships for students to attend our schools and then to attend other schools, and we've now supporting about 15,000 students attending 800 to 900 colleges in a given year, as well as students supporting our 37 member schools. And obviously, many people know us through our iconic tagline, "A Mind is a Terrible Thing to Waste," which was created during our first PSA campaign back in 1971-72, and that really launched our advocacy efforts as really trying to shape mindsets around African Americans going to and through college. But one of the things we've had to confront in the last several years is that one of the major impediments, while financial continues to be one, is actually academic. And we see overwhelmingly African-American students failing to get to college in the first place, and many of those who do get there struggle to succeed once they're there. Nationwide, 45% of African-American college students will take remedial coursework while they're in college, which means they're paying for what they should have gotten in high school in college. And we know that two things diminish your likelihood of graduating: the cost of college, which paying for non-credit bearing courses will do, and the amount of time you have to spend there, which taking remedial coursework will also do for you. For those of you who are interested, That's a 45% of African Americans nationwide. In the state of Indiana, African Americans attending college, 55% will take remedial coursework during their college careers. So we believe that we need to engage more directly with communities, in particular African American communities, to really lean in and weigh in on what are the issues that we can do to improve the quality of K-12 so that more students are coming out of high school, college, and career ready, and that those who choose to go to college do in fact go and persist and succeed to great and productive lives beyond that. So to that end, we've been looking for and partnering with communities and community organizations to have these conversations, look at these issues, and really help communities figure out what they can do to help more of their students successfully go on to college. These sorts of conversations are something that we have found that has been helpful to raise up some of these issues and hopefully help community members identify issues they can work on to drive changes for outcomes for African American students. So to that end, this evening we're here to talk about, learn about, discuss, and think about equity in education. We've got a great panel, so I'm going to quickly transition so you can hear from them and not from me. We'll start at the end with Carol Craig. Yes. Yes. Oh, there he is. In fact, I'd like to also then recognize the Superintendent of IPS, Dr. Lewis Farabee, who has joined us. Thanks for coming out this evening. We'll start at the end with the illustrious Carol Craig, education consultant, all around education, educational equity leader and champion here in Indianapolis. Dr. Wanda LeGrand, Deputy Superintendent for Academics at IPS. Emily Polino, Executive Director for KIP Indy. And Ahmed Young, Director, Office of Education Innovation here at the City of Indianapolis. So for this evening's conversation, Camila and I are going to drive some of the initial Q&A and conversation, get things moving with the panelists, and then we're going to transition to question and answer from the audience. I will say this once now, and then I'll say it again when it's your turn to ask questions. When it's your turn to ask a question, simple rules. Ask a question. You can dispense with the prelude, the wind-up, and all that, and get right to the question so we can hear from the panelists and hear the answer. If you want to give a speech, we'll invite you to be on the panel next time, and then you can do that, since we're all clear. And we know food's in the back. For those of you who have not eaten, feel free. For those who have eaten and are still hungry, help yourself. Those of you who need to know, I was an elementary school teacher, so the other important thing, when and how you're going to eat, and when, where, and how do I get to the restroom. Restroom is immediately out the door to the left. Now that everybody's basic needs are met, we're going to go ahead and jump right in. So I'd love to give all the panelists to sort of get things going. And those of you who've come in, just feel free to mosey on into a seat. I'd love to have each of the panelists get us going with just tell us real quickly from your perspective and your work, why is this issue of educational equity such a priority in the work that you do every day? And we'll get started with Carol.
Thank you, and thanks for this opportunity. It's such a priority because it impacts what you were just saying in your opening about what happens with our children of color in trying to be successful in higher education. And if you back that up, what's happening in the K through 12 system that keeps that from happening. So there are the inequities in school discipline that occur, some conscious and much of it unconscious, that keeps our children from completing their 12th grade education because of so many days out of school due to exclusionary discipline. So exclusionary discipline would be your suspensions and your expulsions. So it impacts the work that I do because I enjoy working with schools and school districts to see what we can do to keep our children in school and to look at alternatives and look at ways of prevention.
It's hard for me to follow Carol Craig. She's a wonderful leader and mentor, sharing her perspectives. For me, equity is important, and we specifically focus on equity with the work that I lead in IPS around racial equity. It's important for us to establish baselines, and the baselines, and people think of that as being a solid line that's the same for everyone. But equity talks about it's not the same for everyone, because you want to meet students and families where their needs are and to help them to be better than they are today. For us, we want every single child in IPS to eventually graduate and be enrolled, employed, or enlisted into the military and be successful. And so when we talk about enrollment, we talk about them being enrolled with the livable wage as well. So not just graduating, but graduating, being able to successfully take care of themselves as well as their families. If we do a great job with them within the K through 12 experience, then that can happen for them. But that can't happen unless we look at equity and we look at having resources given, provided, and developed based on racial equity. And that's our focus.
Thank you for having me this evening. Building off of both of my colleagues and, on the panel, I think for us, in addition to racial equity, is really ensuring that every child has what they need. So leading a small network of charter schools, ensuring that our students who come to us with disabilities are getting the services beyond what is seen in a traditional classroom, and making sure every child is approached from an individual standpoint and getting what they need on a daily basis, and that it is not a generic approach to their education. Our kids come to school with a variety of different needs, and ensuring that they are getting what they need for them to make sure they have choices in life. For us, it's about making sure our kids have the opportunity not only to graduate from a K-12 system, but also to ensure that they have opportunities to choose to go to college, to choose to join the services. But regardless, they are ready for the workforce and ready for post-secondary education.
I concur with everything that was stated, and I'll just move on to the Q&A. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. I apologize in advance, Sekou. I'm going to break your first rule. I'm going to throw out a little prelude, and then I'll answer your question.
You can do that because your answer.
Oh, perfect, perfect. That'll work. I'm excited to be here. You know, I look around the room, I see educators, I see concerned citizens, I see stakeholders, and it almost feels like a family reunion because we're all concerned about equitable issues as it relates to educational outcomes. And it's an honor to be here because I feel like I'm a gumshoe, and I'm preaching to individuals that have been working tirelessly. So I'm also curious and anxious to hear from you all, and not just your questions, but the follow-up conversations after we leave here this afternoon. I look at this as laying the foundation for all the great work that's to come over the next 4, 8, and 25 and 50 years. And I know many of you have dedicated more than 50 years in this profession and education as a whole, but I'm looking forward to following in your footsteps. As it relates specifically to equity in education, we have to look at how do we define equity? Equity can be defined as it relates to education as making sure that each and every student has access to a high quality, high caliber education, and meeting, like Dr. LeGrand said, meeting them as they are and building upon where they're falling short and making sure that they have great outcomes. That's what I'm excited about doing, and making sure that individuals in the mayor-sponsored charter schools, making sure that individuals in IPS, Lawrence Township, Pike Township, superintendents from Speedway and other organizations are all at the table, and I'm looking forward to this great conversation. So.
Dr. LeGrand, I know that you're leading the work around the race and equity training within the district. Sometimes conversations we have around education feel like proxies for conversations about race. So how has the work that you guys have been doing for the race and equity training, what does that look like within IPS, and what have you all learned from some of that training?
So one thing that's true about this training is that it hits race head-on, which I think is unlike some other trainings. For those of us who've been in education for a while or just been in the anti-racism work, sometimes you participate in training and you, like you mentioned, you might skirt around race. And you want to have a conversation where you feel comfortable as cultures being all the same. But our approach is to talk about race head-on. It's led by the Racial Equity Institute. If you were to Google them, REI is the training group that leads our work, and their website shares what they share with us. But for us, the training is that you talk about race. Because if you disaggregate data, if you look at it by race, you're looking at it by race. And unless we talk about it by race, then you're not going to have suggestions or solutions that are dedicated to race. So one thing that you will see that's different if you were to attend a training or if you go to their website is that there's a real conversation about race. So you won't leave the conversation saying we didn't talk about black students. You won't leave the conversation saying we didn't talk about white students. But we do say those words. We do say black and we do say white. I've been in trainings before where they'll just want to say things that might not be as in your face or as crystal clear as talking about race. But if the common denominator around success or the lack thereof is all about race, then we need to talk about race. And so I think that's a part that makes it very different for us. I also want to acknowledge that Dr. Pat Payne is in the audience. She's a part of our work with the racial equity pilot schools and our work in IPS around racial equity. So I want to make sure that I honor the queen that's in the room. She's here to correct me if I say anything wrong. Or take credit that if I sound pretty competent, it's because of Dr. Payne as well. Does that answer your question, Camila?
Absolutely.
I'd love to hear from several people, but I'd like to start with Emily on. Emily, you talked a lot about need and giving students what they need, which I think is a slightly different framework than oftentimes what schools actually do for children. So could you talk a little bit more about what that looks like at KIPP, and then I'd love to have other people weigh in on what they've seen and what they think that needs to look like in more schools.
Sure. And would you like me to speak to the special education portion specifically?
Well, why don't we include that in,
Okay.
in sort of large context as
Sure.
well? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, as Dr. LeGrand mentioned, kids are coming every day with a variety of different challenges, and ensuring that our educational system is supporting the needs of all of our students, whether that is a specific learning disability, whether that is cultural competence, and ensuring that our curriculum is accessible to our kids and represents the race and the background that they have, the communities that they've grown up in. And so for us, obviously, as a smaller entity, ensuring that we are student-focused and flexible every year. So in the 7 years that I've been at KIPP, our special education work has changed drastically during that time. Our student body, about 20% of our students receive services. Some of them get services in the classroom through like a push-in. Some of them are in specific classrooms for kids that have emotional disabilities. We just started that program 5 years ago in reaction to the students that had enrolled at our school. Last year, we started a program for kids with specific cognitive disabilities, again, because those were the needs that we're seeing in the building. So I think it's really important to be able to address what's happening with our kids on a day-to-day basis and design our programs in our schools to meet those needs. And what that means is that we need to be incredibly flexible because the challenges of our kids are changing. Our students change every year, and ensuring that we are building systems that allow us to adapt to meet the specific needs of our kids is critical to ensure that they stay on that path and get what they need.
So speaking of that flexibility, it gets us to an interesting point about best practices. And Carol, I know that you've really championed a lot of work of creating best practices within school discipline policies. Can you share some of those best practices and where we've seen challenges within our community where there's not consistency across schools in how discipline is handled?
Okay, thanks for that question, Camila. It actually, when you try to answer that question, it goes deeper and wider into what has been going on in the first place. When it comes to school discipline, there are maybe a couple of us in the room that are a little seasoned, where we go back to days when this was not an issue. And it was not an issue because the expectation was that our responsibility was to be sure every child before us was to get a full education. And even when there was misbehavior, the misbehavior would be dealt with and then the child remains in school. So what happened over a period of time was there was the Gun-Free Schools Act, and when that came into place, that was designed only for weapons. And so that's when the zero tolerance policies came into place. And what happened, there became a national fear of youth and a fear of violence, but actually the data wasn't saying that. But because of that, a lot of schools started putting in place zero tolerance policies. That means we have more than just the fact that you have a weapon, but if you're in a fight, profanity, even truancy, tardiness to school became a part of what a child could be suspended for. And if you check the Indiana Code for discipline allows that. So when you have that kind of system in place, that's a punitive system as opposed to a positive system. And some of us in the room also fight for the criminal justice system to eliminate penal systems that punish. But that's the same type of system when you have zero tolerance policies. So when you look at alternatives, it becomes really multi-dimensional because you have to look at what is causing that. And when we look at causes, there are multiple causes. There's some that think it's just poverty and that we just have it because we have children that are poor. But when you look at the wealthy school districts, you'll find the same disproportionality. Black children are 3 times as likely to be suspended. So it's the policy that is allowing this. It's not the behavior of the children. So when you're looking at what alternatives would work, the alternatives have to look at how are we treating children? What are our perceptions when it comes to children? Because you can have a child in room 201 where there's no problem with that child goes to room 204, and then there's a problem. So what does that say? There's perceptions about what the teacher sees, and then, of course, we know children will react to what the perceptions are. So we have to be sure that our policies don't allow for that. And one of the things in Indiana has a policy that allows for suspensions for something subjective. So I can think Dr. LeGrand is being defiant, and I can have her suspended for defiance because that's in the Indiana code, but it's subjective. So alternatives have to eliminate subjectivity and have suspension only for those things that endanger safety, which would be guns, weapons, drugs, that type of thing. So when we get into alternatives, one of the first things, and I know Dr. LeGrand, because of the work she's doing with race and equity, it goes hand in hand, and Dr. Payne, we have to look at how do we view race, what are our unbiased opinions about race, what kind of perceptions do we have about black males, and how is that entering? So that can only come through training. So the great training that IPS and some of the other districts do have to be done in order to make an impact on what happens. There has to be training on implicit bias, because we all have that, but we don't necessarily know it. And then there's a great program called Restorative Justice or Restorative Practices. And I've been talking with the dean at one of the schools, and they're really using that. They've trained their teachers, they've trained the children, they've trained the community, all of the staff, and what they've seen is a remarkable difference in their suspensions. They're considerably lower. So I won't take the time to go into that practice, but it's restoring relationships. It's all about, if I've wronged you, let's talk about it and let's figure it out. And you have a mediator, somebody that takes them through the process, but you have to have considerable training. Another best practice would be, as was mentioned, the cultural responsiveness. Emily, I think you mentioned that, the cultural responsiveness. That means if I have a school with 70% black, and I'm not talking about black communities and talking about the strengths of them. Many times we'll have staffs that see a particular subgroup as a deficit, and instead look at it as the strengths of that community, and also talk about social justice and have training on both of those. Those are great alternatives. So I could go on and on and on, but those are a few of the best practice alternatives. Oh, I have to mention one, and that's positive behavior support. But with that one, you have to have the cultural responsiveness. If you don't have that with it, school districts have seen improvement in suspensions, but not with their black students. So it's still disproportionality, which is the inequity.
So, Ahmed, we want to get you in here. And I know that there are a lot of different measures for schools. You recently co-authored a piece in an op-ed in the Indy Star where you talked about other measures for schools outside of ISTEP, and equity being one of those. Can you share a little bit about what you all are doing from the city perspective on equity?
I can, and I will, but I want to address some of the things that my esteemed panelists brought up, starting with Emily and how it relates to special education, particularly the over-identification of black males in special education. And until we're able, I'm going to pick up on what Dr. LeGrand said as well as it relates to having direct conversations about race. So first looking at special education, and then the correlations between special education and the over-identification of young black males, starting at the kindergarten level, and then kind of transitioning down to what Dr. Craig has said several times about race and discipline and disproportionality as it relates to African-American males. I'm coming from the perspective of a kid that grew up in D.C., attended D.C. public schools, and then moved to Indiana. And throughout my experience within D.C. public schools, I had great champions and great advocates. One of my biggest advocates for my education was my mother, and she made sure that I wasn't one of those individuals that was identified as special education because I had discipline issues. I wasn't a model student early on. I wasn't one of those kids that stepped up to the plate and volunteered all the time. I had my issues, but I wasn't immediately identified as special education because of those behavior issues. And we need to really address the over-identification of black males and recognizing it as a race issue early on. As it relates to the equity reports and 5 essentials and great schools, it's essential that our parents fully understand the health and the robust, whether it's robust or not, status of our schools, and making sure that they have accurate information that reflects what's actually taking place in the schools. the equity reports and our partnerships with IPS, the Mayor's Office, and the Mind Trust is focusing on being able to disseminate that information in a meaningful way to parents and community stakeholders. And that information includes suspensions, expulsions, attendance, enrollment, teacher quality, and all these pieces of data points. And we have a system where we focus on the A through F academic growth of our students, but there's so much more than that. It's so much more to create a full picture of the school's health. One of the things I point to immediately is we have our annual physicals. You know, you go to your doctor. Do you want him to hand you just a simple piece of paper with an A through F on it? Definitely not. We need more information. We need to know how my heart's operating. We need to know my BMI. I need to know whether I am getting closer to a diabetes spectrum and things like that. I need that information, and the same thing relates to our schools. We need a comprehensive picture of the health of our schools, and the equity reports, great schools, and partnerships with IPS, all the other districts as well, is part of that. So.
Excellent. That's really helpful. I'm going to go back to this issue of discipline a little bit. Carol mentioned this around exclusionary discipline, and I think if you think about it, oftentimes we find ourselves disciplining children for behavior, bad behavior, inappropriate behavior. Sometimes that's subjective. But disciplining children actually oftentimes is rationing access to education. So we're taking children who oftentimes need more, need better, as Emily was pointing out, like we've got to meet their needs, and then we take it away or take what they need from them. I'd be curious to hear in particular from Emily and from Dr. LeGrand, like how do you in a school or in a school district address the need to provide discipline for children when they do misbehave and we're trying to help them behave better, but not ration or take away access to education from them in the process?
I think I'd start from the very beginning to the preventive measures around discipline. So the key for all of it, I believe, is relationships. I spent the past 3 days in an elementary school, and 2 days, yesterday they didn't know me, but by today most of them really knew me. It was about relationships, and where they might not have been the same with someone who was a stranger, once they got to know me and they knew me, oh, today she's back again. It's all about relationships. So initially we have conversations with teachers about developing those relationships, and that's the key for positive behavioral supports working, as well as the restorative justice about having relationships with students. The relationships with students will eliminate most of the problems that you see in classrooms, 100%. So I remember teaching high school, and I was all of 5'4", and there was a young man in my class who was 6'10", and so I was 22 and he was 18. I was a high school teacher, so I was a little intimidated by all of that. But I learned early on it was all about the relationships with students, all about them once they know you care. So at the beginning, the proactive measure to reducing suspension, so we won't have to ration education, is to develop relationships with students. But then when there becomes time that the relationship might be not as helpful, and that you need to find, as Carol mentioned, alternatives to putting them out of school. Because lost instruction, and we've talked this year in IPS about attendance, lost instruction is detrimental no matter what. So if you miss school, you're missing an opportunity to be successful every day. And we only have 180 days of them, and we don't want to have 179, let alone do we want to have fewer, because we've not given you all the days. And so we want to have alternatives to removing you from the school. So the alternatives could be removing them to a separate room for a little while, removing them to a smaller group, but alternatives to removing them from school, because the last thing we want to do is to not have them in school. And I love the way you mentioned it, Sekou, about rationing education. I hate that, pains my heart that we dole it out a little bit, but we need to dole it out every single day and not ration it with them. So we try to encourage teachers to have relationships first, and then that's, of course, it's helpful when you get to know students where they are, as Carol mentioned, their culture, their background, and their likes and dislikes. So the building of relationships will be a proactive measure to reduce those suspensions or the discipline that's given, and then alternatives from removing them from school. And there's so many things you can do other than putting a child out of school.
And I think building off of what Dr. LeGrand said, the additional thing I would add is how are we also helping our kids develop the coping mechanisms necessary? So as you know, Ms. Craig mentioned defiance, which is a very subjective disciplinary issue that arises frequently in schools, oftentimes because there isn't a relationship built and the student doesn't trust the adult that's interacting with them in the moment. How can we also support our kids with developing coping mechanisms when they get in a situation and they become frustrated? And how are the places that we're leaning in and providing that additional social skill building to support our students in making those decisions when we get to a place where maybe we're in a situation that is challenging for the student and there is a difficult interaction either with another student or with an adult in the building. So beyond like how can we build the relationships on the front end and create some of these alternative placements, whether they're for an hour, as Dr. LeGrand mentioned, or potentially a slightly longer period of time if a kid needs to cool down or be removed or get instruction in a different environment. How are we also supporting our kids with developing the skills as things come up in their life as they do, whether they're in school or in their neighborhood or when they're in college or on the workforce, to be able to react in situations where they might not have the relationship that they need, either because the adult hasn't built it or it's a new person or whatever, or somebody makes a mistake, to support them in making decisions and letting people know when they have been harmed or when things have gone in a direction that is not appropriate for that child.
I'm so
May I add
glad.
one other- I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Dr. LeGrand.
The only thing that I would add is that having parents as partners. So having conversations with parents, all parents want the absolute best for their children. And so having conversations with parents to say, I really want the best for little Emily. Tell me more about Emily. Tell me what I can do better in the classroom to meet Emily's needs. Because I'm sure that Emily is great at home, but she might not be great for Wanda today. And so help me to be a better educator. But parents as partners is key. And parents have to feel like you really want them to have a partnership, and that you're not blaming them or any other circumstance, but you see them as true partners in all of this.
There are two experiences that I've had over the last 10, 15 years or so that really have shaped my philosophy on education and where we are as it relates specifically to discipline. And Dr. LeGrand, you hit on this directly as it relates to relationships. As a teacher, I would spend the first almost 2-3 weeks not touching the standards, not touching curriculum, not touching a single book, but really getting to know each and every one of my students. So as they walked into the classroom within those first few days, Mr. Young knew your name. Mr. Young knew your parents' name. Mr. Young knew a portion of your story. And knowing that laid the foundation for the rest of the school year. Not saying the rest of the school year was perfect, but it laid the foundation to have those difficult conversations, to address those really substantive issues that each child comes into the classroom with. Then the second element, second experience, was serving as a deputy prosecutor. One of the titles that I had as a deputy prosecutor was having to deal with juvenile repeat offenders. I'm going to say that those three words again, juvenile repeat offenders. Those were individuals that stepped into the courtroom on 25th and Keystone that had multiple offenses, multiple referrals into the criminal justice system as juveniles. Many of those started with something that was as minute as defiance, a behavioral issue that escalated. And in all actuality, they only needed some health and human services, some counseling, and some other type of treatment instead of a direct referral to the Marion County Prosecutor's Office. And those experiences inform the decisions that I make now and the policies that I advocate for in the mayor's office. So I'm glad we're having this conversation.
So much of, I think, the conversation around equity, people will agree that people need to be treated equitably, especially students. What are the challenges to implementing some of these policies? I know that, Carol, when you were working with the legislation to make sure that there was some commonality in the school discipline policies, it wasn't just agreed upon. What
No, it
was the
wasn't.
opposition?
There are quite a few issues, as I indicated. It's very multidimensional. It's very complex. One of the biggest challenges has to do with resources. As you indicated, most people agree that we should be better and we should not be putting children out of school. Most people can agree to that. But what happens is a lot of times our educators are so frustrated. They're frustrated because resources have been pulled from them. And if we track what's happened to our urban schools in the recent legislation where the dollars were pulled from them and the dollars went to the suburban districts. And once you start doing that, you look at, well, where do schools cut? They begin to cut the only places they can. Those are your support staff, your counselors, your social workers, the people that can help. So the barriers have to do with funding and resources because the schools need more support. I've talked to several educators, principals, as well as teachers, and they need more mental health support in the schools. Dr. Virginia Kane indicated that with the youth from 14 to 24, 46% of them are classified as mentally ill. So within that, you've got all depression, you've got all these challenges that as schools, we want to see how we can help, but it takes funding, it takes resources. Then another thing that schools are suffering from, I'm so glad IPS reinstated, was able to put in place some professional development days. But many of us remember when we had several professional development days, and then that was taken away through legislation. The dollars for professional development was taken away. So when you take away those kinds of supports for our teachers, you make it very frustrating. And those of us that were in secondary education, I remember when we only taught 5 classes a day. And 5 times 30, that's 150. But when you're teaching 6 a day and you multiply that times 30 and sometimes it's 40, then what happens is our teachers are absolutely stretched. And then how much time do they have to really do the kinds of things that Dr. LeGrand mentioned when you really want to take a prep period, a lunch period, to talk and give the students that personal attention, you don't really have that. Then another factor that comes into play in Indiana, we have a lot of districts that see this only as an urban issue. So because we're mostly a small rural state with small districts, they don't engage in that. The legislature has no interest in that because their constituents don't have an interest in it. So they push back on it when we talk about that. And then a fifth thing would be that we're a local control state. And so you get pushback from school districts, and I'm not saying that, I wouldn't understand that happening, but you get pushback when there are mandates through legislation that tell schools what they have to do. So that was a big issue. But what we do, we take the advocacy that we can get, and we take the legislators that do support this effort, and we keep pushing for a little at a time. And I don't know if a lot of people know that we were able to make some gains this past year with a particular bill. It was House Bill 1635. We were able to get a little bit. What we were able to get was we were able to get a mandate where the Department of Education must give more guidance to the universities for the schools of education to be sure that those schools are infusing cultural competency and classroom management throughout all of their coursework. And we were able to get flexibility with the Safe Schools Fund, so schools could use that for professional development. And we also got where the data for suspensions and expulsions, and unfortunately it's only Marion County, will be disaggregated and reported. So now you will be able to see that a particular school has disproportionate number of suspensions for black males, for example. So we were able to get some gains, but we'll keep working to get more.
We're coming your way in a second. So we're going to do, I think, 1 or 2 more questions, then we're going to turn to the audience for theirs. I'd love to hear a little bit more from the panelists, because Carol talked about resources and the belief that there's some shortage of resources we need.
Or how they're used.
Or how they're used, which I think is a good point, because we see the distribution being different, how they're applied in districts versus charters, and that's, I think, an interesting way to look at it. I'd be curious, though, if each of you could share we've got 70-ish people here, what are the things we should be advocating for around how we use those resources to support children so that we get to equity?
Okay, I'm going to bring up one. It may be some disagreement on this, but the research shows that more dollars have been spent on security forces for schools, police officers, than for counselors and social workers on the front end. The data shows that a school that's heavy with police force is no more positive and no safer than a school without them. It's the philosophy of the school, the philosophy of the leadership, and whether or not relationships have been built. So I would suggest we look at how we spend our dollars there. And second would be the prison system. we're spending much more on a prison system than we are on the supports that are needed for education.
So Carol took most of mine, so I can say ditto. I would just say advocate for the proactive resources, the professional development, as Carol mentioned, as well as the supportive folks in the building, so the counselors and the social workers.
I'm not sure that I have a ton to add to Dr. LeGrand's comments. I think ensuring that our staff are ready to support our kids and we have both the time for professional development as well as the resources and the appropriate teams in place to make sure that's happening for our teachers and for our administrators, as well as the support services for mental health and social workers and counselors on the ground for our kids and families.
I'll take a slightly different approach. Truly investing in pre-K is a long-term view on addressing some of our needs, but having fully funded pre-K here in the state of Indiana hasn't been stated yet today, but it's something that we've talked about extensively over the last several years. It's saddening, it's disheartening, it's frustrating. I have a ton more adjectives to describe how pathetic it is that we don't have fully funded pre-K here in the state of Indiana. And Ms. Craig just said it. It's unconscionable. It really is. So making the case to our General Assembly that we need to fully fund pre-K. And I went to a pretty large school and for high school, and I barely saw my school counselor. Right. You know, I think I knew her name, and I think she knew me as I walked down the hall, but that's about it. But truly having an opportunity to advise students about their career options, their college options, their post-secondary options is essential as well.
There's a bill, I don't think it will be heard this year because it's probably considered a budget bill, but it will be coming up next year, and it has to do with assessing all the schools in Indiana with regard to their counselors, social workers, and their support staff. So I encourage everyone to advocate for that bill when it comes up next year.
And two things, there's seems to be wide agreement on pre-K, so that's something we should certainly revisit and figure out how we can move forward collectively on. One, nationally, college counselors to students, the ratio is 400 students to every one guidance counselor in a school. So to Ahmed's point, I mean, if you think about that, the likelihood that the counselor has any passing idea who most of the students they're supposed to be supporting is probably pretty low.
Right. And in Indiana, a lot of them are being used for standardized testing, so that makes it even worse.
Yeah, and you know, to this issue of sort of parents and equity, one of the challenges is, you see this in schools as a practical issue. The college counselors often know the kids whose parents know to put the students in touch with the counselor and to follow up with them, right? So they're gonna respond to the person who's following up and chasing them around, and the other 250 who don't know to do that don't get what they need. And so I think we've got to be more attentive to that. We're going to go to questions. My one piece of instruction, quickly to a question. Tell us your name, organization you're affiliated with, and your question. And if you direct it to an individual panelist or to the group, feel free. Mark, you're up, and then we've got a mic here and a mic there for anyone who's ready next.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark. I'm with the Indianapolis Urban League. My specific question would be for Dr. Wanda, Emily. Hello, Emily. And Ahmed. You know, if I was a parent here, I would feel very shortchanged because we haven't talked a lot about parental resources versus school needs. So my question, I want to drive back onto the disproportionate designation of black males in special education. This specific question is, a great many of those males are in the two most subjective categories of special ed designation, mildly mentally retarded and emotionally disturbed. So Ahmed for the Mayor's Charter of Schools, Dr. LeGrand for IPS, Emily for KIP, what is the number and percentage of black males in your schools who are so designated? If you do not have the data, when are you going to get it? When you get the data, will you make it available to the parents and the public? And will you give the parents real tools and tips on how to deal with the havocs of that extra designation, especially when suicide is a leading cause of death for black men 15 to 24?
Well, I appreciate your question, Mark, and I touched upon it a little earlier in my comments, and it's something that I'm personally vested in. And I also mentioned the equity reports 5 essentials. These are tools that go beyond simply an A through F system. And this is a tool that is currently being put together in order to disseminate that disaggregated information, exactly what you're looking for, looking at the number of individuals that are designated as special education, individuals that are suspended at a disproportionate amount, individuals, and it breaks down from suspensions, expulsions, race, free and reduced lunch, all these different subgroups, and that information will be readily accessible to parents, to community stakeholders, to all individuals that want and need that information so they can make informed decisions about not only the schools that their children may or may not attend, but how our schools are actually faring as it relates to our African American males, females, and other groups. That's the information that I was just referencing, Mark.
Are you going to get it when you release it? Do you have
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers right offhand, but that's exactly what the equity reports are talking about. So, yes.
I'd like to make a little side comment on that. With the special education, that is really a deep issue that I think we don't spend enough time in a community talking about, and I appreciate Mark asking that question. A lot of people don't realize, too, with special education, disproportionate number of special needs children are suspended. And this is in Indiana and nationally. And a lot of people don't realize in Indiana, 61 counties were found guilty by the feds for disproportionate suspension of special education students. This was a couple years ago, and so some of the districts have had to pay a penalty because of that. I'm proud to say IPS was not one of them, but a couple years ago, 61 counties, and they had to, as I said, pay that penalty and get into training to alleviate that. So these kinds of things occur, and a lot of times the public does not know, the parents do not know this is occurring. But it's a serious issue, and if you look at the graduation rate of special needs children, it is so low. And so with the high numbers, look how that's impacting our African American students and Hispanic.
One thing that I'll add, and Mark, I also appreciate that question. I love looking at data because I think data tells us a lot. It should provoke us to good works, as my grandmother would tell me, so that we can do better for our children. For the data, and as I'll piggyback on what Carol mentioned, that our special ed data on their achievement, along with the disproportionate number of students, needs a closer look from us in IPS. We've recently hired a special ed officer, Brent Freeman, and one of his first tasks that I gave him was just to review the data. So I have it for you. I want you to see it. I want you to see how our special ed children perform. Because if you're not aware of the situation, then you're not able to create a plan. Another thing that we talked about when he came on board is it's very important for us to have conversations with parents, and so that parents understand really what special ed is all about. So not that you're just throwing out acronyms or you're saying sign here because it's going to be better for your children, but have conversations so they really know. So those of us as educators have conversations with lay people about special ed. So there's an informed decision before you sign on the line that said my child is special ed. So a part of his reorganization of special ed does have a person that will be dedicated to parent support. So I don't know the numbers by heart, but I'm sure it's someone on my desk, and so now you provoked me to go find it to know by heart.
I also appreciate the question, Mark, and would be happy to provide you the numbers from KIPP. I can't tell you specifically. I can say, particularly with students with emotional needs, it's a small number in terms of boys, African American boys who are in that cohort. I could probably count them on one hand, but I can get you the specific numbers. The other thing I would say, and something that I'm really proud of that I think we've done, is just continue to try and address the academic needs of our kids. And what we're seeing mid-year this year is actually our students with special needs are making significantly more growth than our students in the general education population. And across almost every grade level in both reading and math, we're seeing magnitudes of growth that are beyond what we would have expected midway through the year. And so that's something that I think we are certainly not there yet, right, as I think any of us in education would say. But as we continue to try and address what's happening with individual students and create differentiated programs, we're seeing some progress year over year in terms of our students with special needs. And I'll be happy to pass along all the data to you.
So one of the things I'll just add to what Ahmed said about the equity reports, it's exactly to get at this point that you're mentioning, Mark, because I think that the data is out there. It's collected by schools, and they report it to the Department of Education. But it's really hard to look for all of that information and then break it down by subgroup. So the equity reports that will be released in November will have all of those metrics broken down by subgroup, but then you can also compare schools. So what's happened in other cities like DC where they did the equity reports, just having that information accessible to families so that they can see and compare schools really changed behavior of schools. But you have to highlight where those inequities are for those things to sometimes be, people be made aware of them.
And Camila hit on a really important point, and she said accessible. Accessible doesn't just mean you can reach out and grab it. Accessible also mean that it's something that's conveyed in a meaningful, understandable way, recognizing the fact that all of our parents don't have JDs and PhDs and the like. So the information that's conveyed, it isn't condescending, but it's conveyed in a way that's meaningful and understandable for all of our parents, whether they have secondary education or not. So.
We're really excited to have WFY recording today, so this conversation can be available to people who couldn't be here today. But that's just a reminder, so when you come up and ask a question, make sure to speak into the mic so that they can hear your question.
You get uncomfortably close to the mic.
Yeah, Anthony Bridgman. Let me see if I can raise this up a little bit. Thank you. There's one aspect of this, I guess it cuts across class, culture, race, but it's just the new science of neuroscience, how brains, young brains develop. There's a lot of new information about the teenage brain, a lot of information about, beyond not even the adolescent brain, but younger people than that, and how neurotransmitters are affecting decision making, impulse control, their ability to learn. I mean, a lot of students, maybe coming into the classroom with high stress levels, and we know, the science, the data is telling us that high cortisol levels, impedes with the firing of neurons that are responsible for learning, right? So, I mean, how are the different school systems, or you as educators, how are teachers and policies and those and the like being informed by not so much class and culture, which obviously we know that those are important, but those specific science oriented things.
I can say with the legislation that did pass, Anthony, that 1635 I was sharing with you, in that bill when it talks about the prescriptions for what the educators need to know in the schools of education, social and emotional learning and child development are all in there. Because that was more of an emphasis years ago. Again, some of us remember we were really heavy on child development, and as a secondary person, we spent a lot of time studying adolescent development and being sure our lesson plans reflected that knowledge and the neurosciences. So we've gone back to that with working with the Department of Ed, so I can speak from that level, what's happened legislatively.
The part that I would add is that some universities are doing a pretty good job with it. I remember as a principal, and they would, as the information cycles through as a high school principal, maybe about 16 years ago now, brain-based theory was a big buzzword for this. And so there was professional development, but students also, college students graduated with the knowledge. So that information is traditionally oftentimes shared in the university, but then it's also reinforced within the schools, within the professional development. It impacts not just your lesson plans, but your scheduling of the day. So how many minutes do you have in a class? How much time do you dedicate to specific subjects on specific topics before you change it, because the adolescent mind might need to change it based on their age and the topics that you're studying.
The other thing I would add is I think most adults have about 10 words to describe how they're feeling. And so one of the things, and there's some research out of Yale that we use across our schools, is basically quadrants where kids are able to describe their emotions. So they're picking a feeling word that's in yellow, that's in red, that's in green, that's in blue. And also figuring out what are the coping strategies to move between those quadrants. So is it taking deep breaths? Is it taking a lap around the hall? Like, what is it you need to do to be able to describe that you are infuriated right now? And then what's the action you need to take to be able to get yourself to, the green or the blue where I'm calm and, can have a conversation. And so making sure teachers have the professional development and the language themselves to be able to then work with kids on identifying their own emotions and then scheduling throughout the day, like Dr. LeGrand said, whether those are brain breaks for small kids. So, in our kindergarten classes, teachers know we're not going to have kids who are 5 years old doing anything for more than 3 minutes, right? And when you do, you see what that disruption looks like in the classroom because kids are wiggly, they're rolling around, and then it leads to them being defiant and the teachers then yelling and the trickle. You can see it happen because of where the kids are developmentally. And so how are we supporting our teachers in creating lesson plans where every 3 minutes kids are doing a turn-in talk? After 10 minutes, they are no longer on the carpet, they are doing something else. So structurally, we are addressing that in our classrooms to best meet where our students are.
Just two really quick points. First, I have a 4-month-old that I'm looking forward to getting home to and holding it and talking to her. And I say that intentionally because being conscious of brain development, even at those earlier stages, with an infant, with a toddler, and when I sit down and I talk to her, I look at her in her eye, and she holds and touches my face and holds my finger, and she gives me that smile. Though it warms my heart, it's something that's very deliberate. I'm talking to her because I know she needs to hear as many words as possible, even at that earlier stage, even though she can't really take in and comprehend what I'm saying. I know it's impacting her brain development. So thinking about brain development even at the earliest stages, and then, like I said earlier, thinking about pre-K. And the second point that I want to make very quickly is empathy. We talk a lot about these big ideas, and adults are making decisions about benefiting adults in the education realm. But what level of the human element are we focusing on? How much empathy are we exhibiting as teachers and educators when a student comes to me and he or she lashes out? How much willpower does it take to just to step back and try to think about the context in which that child made that impulsive decision? So we really need to tap into a certain level of empathy in the classroom as well.
Thank you.
I do want to give kudos to Kip because I did, when I visited Kip and she took me on a tour, you didn't know I was doing my own cultural audit of your school.
I did not. She did not.
But her school really responds, and I have no reason to say this, okay? Her school really responds to what Anthony was saying. Your school really responds to child development. I did see all what you spoke of, all in the halls, in the classrooms. And so it's up to the leadership to be sure that their school is responsive to the developmental stages of the particular child.
And that wasn't a planned visit either.
No, it's not. I don't do planned
Ms. Craig
visits.
doesn't do planned visits.
Hi, thank you. My name's Clyde Gaw. I'm with the Art Education Association of Indiana. To touch on Anthony's question, what the neuroscience says is multisensory experience is critical. And what my perspective is, children are not getting enough of that in school today. Experiential learning, critical. But I didn't come here to talk about that. I came here to talk about democracy in education. Because what we're seeing is not democracy in education. We're seeing children being told about it, but they're not experiencing democracy in education. And that's reflected in the voter turnout. In Marion County, 2015, it was 22%. In Indiana, in the general election 2014, it was 28.7%. Even the 2008 election, which was a major election nationwide, it was under 60%, maybe it was 60%. You think about how we prepare children to participate in a democracy. We do not practice democratic education in the classroom. We prepare children for tests. And we use a psychology of instruction based on Pavlovian psychology. I've been in the classroom teaching art for 32 years. I first started teaching art at IPS School 74 and School 110. Children crave multisensory experience. They're not getting enough of it. And they crave having a voice in what they do, a time-sensitive voice, not just a voice every now and then, but time-sensitive that means having administrators, curricula, responsive to the time-sensitive needs of children. Those are my observations. And if we're going to address equity and think about, how we prepare children, as one of the things I did between 2006 and 2009 was I was a ward chair for one of the major political parties here in Marion County. And I oversaw 8 precincts between 2006 and 2009. And I can tell you that the African American communities where our precincts were not voting on election day. And to be quite frankly, neither were any of the other communities. So we have a crisis in democracy, and I think we need to look at how we educate our youngest citizens to participate in the democracy. Thank you.
Thank you for your observations. I appreciate that. Oftentimes our schools, our classrooms serve as a microcosm of what's taking place in the greater society. And when we're not modeling those democratic ideals within the classroom, that's where that disconnect emerges, and it festers and it grows. As a middle school teacher and a high school teacher, I tried to model what it meant to be a citizen of not only that city that I was located in, but a citizen of this country and the world. And the most enjoyable interactions I had with students were those that built upon those multiple intelligences, that built upon what Howard Gardner talked about constantly. Those were things that I built upon and modeled my classroom around. How do we really empower our students, and not in the sense of giving them decision-making ability, but ways to influence how things operate within the classroom and outside of the classroom. And I enjoyed those experiences. Funny enough, I ran into a former Craig Middle School student today, and I looked at her from afar. I said, I recognize that face, but obviously a lot of years older. And I was proud to see that and to learn that she's doing well and she's in college now. But that inspired me to really think about what kind of activities did I do in the classroom that brought about that opportunity. And I know it's not the end all to be all those little opportunities, but it's a small portion of it, And as I stated, our schools are microcosms of our society, and I hope that we can continue to put a focus on civic education, not just in social studies classes, but in a multidisciplinary approach.
And social justice.
Definitely.
So I know many of the people in this room, and I have to admit, I am surprised that there are 2 microphones and not one person up with a question. So I'm going to ask a question, which is going to hopefully encourage somebody else to come up and ask a question as we still have some more time. And we've heard a little bit about parents, and I want to go to that real quickly. So I started my career as an elementary school teacher 23-ish years ago, and I remember that first month calling through to every single parent in the classroom, and relationship. I was calling to put equity in the bank with the parent. I'm going to call and tell you something good about your child before your child has done something for me to call you to tell you something bad about. And one of the most amazing conversations I ever had was with a dad who I spoke to in the first 2 weeks of school, the 6th grade. I call him, tell him Jose's doing this, things are great. And then I'm like, you have any questions for me? It's just dead silence. I'm like, Mr. Vasquez, you there? He says, yeah, this is the first time anyone has ever called to say something good about my son. I was like, well, he's good. I don't know how to respond to that. But I think that there's a gap there, right? We're not doing enough on the relationship, and then we're not doing enough to pull many of the parents who aren't actively engaged. So I'd love to hear from you all. What are your thoughts on how do we proactively reach out and bring parents in and build that relationship so they can be more actively involved and engaged and do what Ahmed brought up earlier, which is actually be champions for their children, which many of their children need them to be much more aggressively doing.
I think I'll answer that question first. For us, I have a similar story. I remember I taught high school math for 7 years, and for every not so positive phone call I made, I also made a positive one, and so that would just be hilarious. I would find a student that I wanted to praise, and so if I'm going to call about 3 to say, These 3 didn't do their homework. There were going to be 3 that I'm going to praise. And everyone can imagine by high school, the high school teachers calling and say, you know, Wanda did a great job in math today. Same thing, dead silence. But Wanda LeGrand, the teacher, was a rock star because I had found the time to give the praise. For us in IPS, we have parent involvement educators in each of our schools. That's a focus for us, that there is a dedicated person, and that's their role for parent involvement. And in way we discuss involvement and engagement. Sounds like my microphone went away. That we discuss involvement and engagement varies. So we don't believe that a parent has to always come into the building. They're not a muffin mom or a donut dad, and we welcome that. And so our goal for our parent involvement educators is to create a wide array of engagement opportunities so that they can feel engaged and informed, and they're advocates for their students. We want them to push us to be better. We want to have those critical conversations. Some of you in the room are some of my pushers and my critical people that we have conversations with, because we welcome the conflict, because we cannot become excellent as a school district or excellent as a school without having those conversations. So we want to empower parents to tell us that we need to do more for your students. Tell us that we're not doing right by them. So we want them to be informed and engaged and advocates for their children within their buildings, and that's the role of our parent involvement educator.
I think with this topic, I think we have a long way to go, because parent voice, I'm not seeing that valued as much as it needs to be. Our parents have a lot to say, and it's very valuable, the information they can provide, but we have set up systems that really, I don't want to say don't want, but that's not a part of the system. To have the parents contribute to the system and help modify it, that's really using parent voice to assist with governance. That's valuing what the parents had to offer. So it's not just about coming to school, as Dr. LeGrand mentioned, but it's about sharing with us, what do you think we need to do to make this better? It's about using parent surveys on a regular basis and then using that data to make improvements. It's about scheduling the entire staff to be out in the community. I see one of my former teachers here who's now in a great position I'm very proud of, but I think she can share with you that as a principal, I had an expectation of not only the positive phone calls, but that we had to be out in the community. And so we were out in the community. I was at a time with one of my schools when I had my kids of color were coming from way across town. So we would go to that church and have programs in that church. We would attend that church. I think we're not doing enough of that. We don't know enough about our communities where our children live. They're not seeing us at their events. So I think we have a long way to go to really look at democracy, as the gentleman was talking about, teaching that and really valuing parent voice and not just giving lip service.
Looks like we have another question. We probably have time for one more question.
And I will keep it brief. I know I had to give a little bit of preface, though. My name is Sydney Rucker, and I'm a doctoral candidate in Higher Education and Student Affairs program at Indiana University, Bloomington. Kind of more so, I will give background that I am not originally from Indianapolis. So I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama, and I taught K through 12 in Atlanta, Georgia, mostly in the Decatur School District. But seeing a panel in this capacity where you have traditional public schooling, KIPP, consultants, people from across the board in different aspects and varieties of education, specifically at the K-12 level, it's very rare to see collaboration in this capacity. So are there other events specifically dealing with equity and access in education that are coming up in the future that we could be aware of, or projects that are ongoing now that you'd like to give any detail about?
I think I've referenced the equity reports that will be coming out in November several times. Also, 5 Essentials. You know, that's a survey, like Ms. Craig mentioned, that really tries to capture the essence of what's really taking place in the schools. And right now it's in a pilot phase where we're surveying teachers, school leaders, and parents to get their feel on all these different things that are taking place within the school, whether it's how robust instruction is, how effective our teachers are? What about the school leaders? Are they actually connecting with the greater community within that particular school environment? So the 5 essentials is really tapping into that survey component that Carol has mentioned. I'm always looking for opportunities to A, listen, and then B, collaborate with any and everyone as it relates to educational outcomes for our students. I don't think I've said no to a meeting since I've been in this capacity. I don't foresee me ever saying no to a meeting either. So when there are opportunities to work with others as it relates to education, I'll be there. And if I can't be there because of a conflict, I have several colleagues within this audience who will work tirelessly to be there as well. So.
The one thing that I'll add for us, our superintendent just recently launched his strategic plan, and you will see within the strategic plan, if you visit our website, information about racial equity. And so we are asking for community members to be a part of the planning, the work of the plan, or really the implementation of the plan. That's where we are now. So if you visit our website, you'll find information.
One other thing I just add, Sydney, is at the Mind Trust, we're focused on every child having access to a great school, and we're agnostic as to the type of the school. So we really encourage a lot of collaboration because we think at the end of the day what matters is a great school. It doesn't matter what type of school that it is. So we have conversations like this, but we also have bus tours that I know that you came on our last one. We have some information on the table on your way out about our next bus tour, where we tour one IPS school and one charter school because we're highlighting high quality schools. So we would encourage you all to participate in those. And then other conversations, we have another conversation, UNCF conversation coming up in May as well. So we'll make sure that you know about that.
Yes, I'm Evangelist Chin. My husband and I are ministers of the gospel. We live here in Indianapolis, and we listen to the news and we read the newspaper. This is to the panelists. We see the issues that the children face every day. You talk about the mental state of the children, and the mental state comes from the things that they are experiencing, things that we didn't, when I was in school, have to go to when they go to the bus stop and it's dark. And sometimes they come home, it's dark. You might have several children in the same family catching buses, 2 and 3 buses. I don't understand how you expect in our neighborhood, a young man has to catch the bus at 6:30. And then the next child catches the bus about 10 of 8. And the next child catches the bus about 20 minutes of 9. We've seen these children go through this. We hear about the crimes. We hear about the robberies. And I just wanted to know, how do you all expect them to really settle down? I don't like to label children as having mental or psychological problems. Some of them really do, but some of it may just be stress of this daily schedule. We see the mother now who's separated from her husband, and she's having to leave her 3 children to get to job. Granddad comes and shuttles them to the bus, but sometimes that doesn't work. And so the whole family's under pressure. And so it seems to me like the children of today are at a disadvantage. And no, they don't always have the community center or the church to go to as we had when we came along. And I think as a community, these kind of sessions are good because it makes us aware beyond. I know your job is hard. We talk about it all the time, that you're supposed to be educators and you're supposed to be teaching, but you're disciplining and you're doing all the things that someone else has failed to do. So I applaud you for what you're doing.
Thank you for what you're doing. Earlier I mentioned empathy and context and understanding what a child walks into as it relates to a school. I grew up, I mentioned earlier, where I walked across the street to my elementary school, John Burroughs Elementary School. And then when I wound up going to junior high school, that junior high school was right down the street, a few blocks away, which I walked to, you know. And but part of the things that's changed And I think we're moving away from it somewhat with the passage of ESSA and seeing how we're kind of trying to move away from that heavy emphasis on high stakes testing and really looking at a portfolio of how this child is growing and what these educational outcomes really should be beyond just, did I pass the I-STEP? Did I just pass I-READ? And that's what it's all about. There's a lot of stress, and some of our students walk into the classroom experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And how do we address those issues? How do we address those mental health issues in an empathetic, understanding, and comprehensive way? So I appreciate your question, and we have a lot of work to do, but with individuals like you, individuals on this panel, and all these community stakeholders, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Well, we want to be respectful of everybody's time, so we are right at 7 o'clock, but I want to give you guys a couple of housekeeping notes before we wrap up and thank our panelists. In your folders, you have some information from UNCF about the work that they're doing. You also have a survey, which we will really use as your ticket to exit. You need to complete the survey because we really need your feedback. We also really value the surveys to let us know what conversations you all would like to hear in the future. If there are other topics that you think we need to discuss as a community, please let us know that on your survey, but also let us know how you think these conversations can be improved, or if there are things that you wish you could have heard about that you didn't hear about today. Also, we have, I mentioned the bus tours that we do. We would love to see, I've seen many of you that are here on the bus tours, but it's a really great way to get inside a school and see some of the things firsthand, hear from the leadership, hear from the students about what makes these schools successful, and it's just a really great way to start your day. So we have some information about our next bus tour, which is April 14th. We will be seeing IPS School 56, Francis Parker, and Hope Academy in the city of Indianapolis. And any other final thoughts? All right, well, please join me in thanking our panelists for such a great conversation this evening. And I'm serious, you can't exit unless you give me your survey.